Welcome to the fourth episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford, and tonight we have an interview with science fiction author Tobias Buckell. Thanks for joining us tonight on the Reading and Writing Podcast. We're joined by Tobias Buckell, a up-and-coming science fiction writer. He's the author of Crystal Rain, Ragamuffin, Sly Mongoose, and the latest media tie-in novel tied into the popular Xbox 360 computer game Halo, and the name of that novel is Halo: The Cold Protocol. Tobias is also the author of multiple short stories, including publication in Writers of the Future Volume 16, and if I'm not mistaken, he was a first-place winner of Writers of the Future for that year, or was it that quarter?
That quarter.
Right.
The yearly winner, I think, if I remember correctly, was Bill.
Yeah, I can't remember. I mean, full disclosure, both Tobias and I were published in that anthology, and that's how we originally met. So how are you doing? I mean, I know before we went on the air, and I know anyone who reads your blogs knows that you had somewhat of a health scare back in November, and are you feeling good now?
Yeah, feeling a lot better. I'm starting to get back into my routine of working at night and working on some of the fiction again, and catching up on all the work that was overdue as I took a break from everything to focus on that. It's nice to be able to start getting in some walks again and not feel winded when I just walk across the house.
Great. That's good to hear. And just to circle back for a second, if I'm not mistaken, you do have a short story anthology in the works. Is that correct? Or I should say collection in the works?
Yeah, I do. I do have a collection of short stories that will be coming out from Worm Publishing, and that is called Tides from the New Worlds. And we're thinking sometime in February or March, that it would come out. So looking forward to that, because my short fiction has been sort of scattered all over the place, magazines, anthologies, and some places online. So bringing it together into one package, I think that'll be pretty cool.
Great. And that's Worm, W-Y-R-M, correct?
Yeah, the non-traditional spelling.
Exactly. And what was the title of that again? That collection?
It's called Tides from the New Worlds.
Great. And I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about your most recent novel, which is the media tie-in Halo: The Cold Protocol. First, are you a Halo player yourself? Do you enjoy the game?
Totally. I have an Xbox 360. Purchased one about a year ago. And one of the things I do for downtime when I, finish work is head on over and play a few rounds of Halo. Also a big fan of Forza Motorsport and a number of other video games I really like. My really good friend Josh Smith at imjosh.com he lives locally, so he's the one who sort of convinced me to get Xbox Live so we could sort of duke it out online against people together.
Sure. I'm an Xbox 360 aficionado myself. I was actually one of the crazy ones who stood in line that first day to get one when they went on sale. I play with my brother in Georgia, so I'm very familiar with the concept of collaborative play online, which is a lot of fun.
It is a lot of fun. One of the weird things about becoming an adult is that you can't really sort of ad hoc throw together a quick room party to play video games against each other or with each other. So, the Xbox Live, I think, is a really great little piece of social engineering, because we're able to kind of keep up with that, collaborative video game playing with friends, despite, jobs and other things that get in the way.
Yeah, it really is neat. I think for people who don't really kind of grasp kind of the ramifications or implications of Xbox Live, it can be kind of eye-opening when you're playing with, in my case, a brother who lives in Georgia, or, if you just do a pickup game with someone you don't know, and you could be playing, Madden football with someone in California. It's a pretty interesting, experience. But
It is.
anyway, back to writing.
Sure.
So how did this project come about? The Halo book.
Well, Tor Books is my publisher for all of my own original novels, and they're also the publisher for the Halo books. So it was a case of, them passing on my book to my books to Bungie. When Bungie was saying that they were interested in, some new writers as a possibility. Like, here, read this guy. He's one of our authors. We've worked with him. See what you think. And the folks at Bungie really kind of dug what I was doing. So, you just kind of get the follow-up, would you be interested in doing this project? And I said, well, yes, of course. I play enough of the video game that I'm fairly, really familiar with the universe, and I would love to fly out to Seattle and talk to the creators of it and see if there's some, a spark, a connection, see if we are all on the same page. And fortunately, we were. We had a good time talking, about, ideas and things we could do. So then it just kind of, moved on from there.
Great, great. And how did you find that experience of writing kind of in someone else's universe? What was that process like? I mean, did you have a pretty regimented area that you could write in? Did you come up with the concept and run it by Bungie? How did that whole process work?
It's not all that different from writing a second or third book in an already existing series that you've done. When I was writing my third novel, Sly Mongoose, I had to spend just as much time, double checking that what I was doing made sense within the context of the previous two books. And when I was working on Halo, I had to do the same sort of process, which was just check and make sure that what I was doing was not conflicting with anything that had come before. In this case, there have been 5 books written before my 6th Halo novel and the 3 video games. And that's a little bit more than just the 2 books I had, but it's a very similar kind of feeling. The big difference being that in this case, there are a lot more people involved. In other case, when I was writing my 3rd novel, I was only checking with myself, looking through my notes, looking at outlines of the previous books to figure out whether what I was writing made sense. In the case of Halo, not only was I relying on my own familiarity with the universe not to make mistakes, but I was also, running it by people at Bungie, who were involved in the process to make sure that they felt that I was not, making any mistakes. But for the most part, it was a very cool and interesting thing where, when I was in Seattle, I had some ideas that I pitched to them, and they had some ideas that they pitched to me. Like, we were hoping we could see X, and I would say, oh, that's a really cool idea. And I could fit it in with Y, which I want to do. And, after we talked, it's just kind of like, well, there's a lot of cool stuff we can do, so let's do it. So
Great.
it was a very comfortable experience. A lot of people ask if it's very structured or, did they just tell you what to write and you went out and wrote it? No, it was a very collaborative thing. We had this really great initial conference where we talked about ideas, and from that, sparked off into, continuing on by long distance what we were doing. And my editor, Eric Rabb, is really cool. He's not only a really fun guy to work with, but he was familiar with the Halo universe as well, being the editor on a number of these projects. So running a lot of stuff by him and seeing if I could surprise him or, not surprise negatively, but sort of kind of get him to go, oh, that's really cool, that thing you did, doing stuff like that was a lot of fun. So the main difference is that it tends to be a little bit more of a collaborative environment. And I can see why for some writers that would be very negative. But since I'm someone who came into writing workshopping novels, and I've run lots of my short stories and novels through workshops, I'm very used to figuring out, how to incorporate useful suggestions from other people that can make my work better. So it's not really a hard thing to do for me.
Great, great. I'm wondering, I think I kind of know where you would stand on this point, given that, you did write this novel, but I'm kind of wondering where you kind of what your thoughts are, because within the genre community, and specifically science fiction and fantasy, there have been some strong proponents. One that immediately comes to mind is
Hmm.
Robert J. Sawyer, who thinks that and obviously I wouldn't want to put words into his mouth, but from everything that I've read, and I'm not saying rightly or wrongly, I'm just saying that this is his opinion, is that media tie-in fiction is a really bad thing for the field at large. And I'm just curious, given kind of this overall discussion about the pros and cons of media tie-ins, I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that whole discussion.
Um, yeah, I mean, I would have to look at the article or the reference from Rob to sort of counterpoint that. But there is a general, um, number of people who don't like media tie-in. It's a genre like any other where it amuses me. I'm fairly agnostic about the whole thing. For me, there are a lot of tie-ins that aren't that great, and there are some tie-ins that are really cool. It's just like when lit people sort of like sneer at science fiction and say, "Oh, it's just all that commercial rocket stuff," And on
Sure.
on on one hand, there is a point where a lot of science fiction and fantasy is written to commercially please an audience. It's a commercial genre in many ways, and in many ways it's completely not. It's completely the opposite. It all depends on what areas of it you're accessing, and what you're reading, and who's reading it and what's going on. It's too big to say it's one thing, and I think media tie-in fiction is too big to say that it's one thing. You have Jeff Vandermeer writing Predator novels. You have, you know, um,
Sure.
lots of authors doing lots of cool things. Matt Stover's doing some really cool things with Star Wars novels.
Hmm.
I could never really work myself up into high dudgeon because anyone who spends 6 months or however many months of their life working on a novel doesn't deserve a lot of crap. Whatever happened, it's still 6 months of someone's life that they invested in something. It's a lot of energy wasted when so many readers really dig on this stuff. It's been
Sure.
really interesting to write a tie-in novel because you get just a lot of. I think one of the things is that young readers and some readers in particular have had the sort of cod liver oil theory of reading stuff down their throat, which is that from a young age they were forced to read or given books because it was quote unquote good for them, and not there are a lot of people in life who never learn to read just for the entertainment value, and thus as a result just don't learn to read. And for some of them that can be broken down with a trusted brand that they know will deliver X, whether it's they know it'll deliver action or adventure or something else that they like. They'll go with it, which is why some people do start out reading nothing but media novels. They'll read the Halo book because they played the Halo video game and they know without having to do research that this isn't going to be sort of cod liver oil rammed down their throats. It's going to be something that they know they'll enjoy ahead of time. And I think that aspect frustrates a lot of people who wish more people would read, and so we get some weird end results.
Sure. And
If
I would wonder too, and again, this is in no way a knock against Rob or what his thoughts are, but I would wonder too if it's somewhat generational, and that a younger generation would be more open to media tie-in fiction, because and I don't have a lot of actual data. This is all just kind of
right.
theorizing, but I would think that the younger generation, and I hate saying that because that indicates that I'm not of that generation, but I would think that tends to have grown up in a world that is definitely more media saturated,
Hmm.
than previous generations, and I think have grown up with a lot of kind of meta fiction and seen popular characters in various forms, whether it's comics and novels, and would be more open to that. I don't know. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back for more of our interview right after this. The Kindle Chronicles is a Friday audio podcast all about the Amazon Kindle e-reader. I'm Len Edgerly, and each week I present Kindle news, tech tips, an interview, a quote, and listener comments. I've been a writer all my life, and I'm doing this podcast because the Kindle has simply renewed my love of reading. I hope you'll stop by for a listen. You can find me at thekindlechronicles.com or by searching for Kindle in the podcast area of the iTunes Store.
Well, and I have seeing as that Rob is a huge Star Trek fan, I don't know what his position on this stuff is, but the I think the thing that interests me is that some people do assume that this is a zero-sum game. In other words, that there's a pie, and that the reason they're upset about media novels is because they take a certain amount of the pie. And they think that if the media novels didn't take that section of the pie, say 25% of the market or 50% of the market, then that would be available for science fiction novels. And that the popularity of media novels then, as a result, in their mind, detracts from the popularity of science fiction novels. And I think I don't know if that's true. I mean, I'd love to see some hard data or some studies, because my instinct is that the people who read media novels were not going to be buying science fiction novels. Think of it as a separate genre. In other words, it's like being upset that mystery novels are selling really well, because if we could just stop giving shelf space to mystery novels, we could sell more science fiction. I think it's enough of a different genre, because it's doing different things for different readers, that it's scratching a whole different itch.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I think that if there was not a media tie-in novel on a bookshelf in a bookstore, I think a lot of the readers who are reading those now would be coming into science fiction and fantasy either via manga or
Right.
some other type of media outside of picking up an Arthur C. Clarke novel for their first experience.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would like to see anyone who's outraged about media fiction get more outraged about the selling of daily journals, because I was at I think of Walden Books the other day, and they'd replaced 2/3 of the science fiction section with a display dedicated to Moleskine notebooks for writing in. So,
Oh, that's horrifying. So
it just happens.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time, because I think that within the genre, which is tending to in my opinion become somewhat more diverse than it has been in the past. You have a unique background in that you were born in the Caribbean, and grew up outside of the continental U.S. And I just wonder what you feel that has kind of brought to your fiction and your perspective as a writer.
Well, I think it's always useful for a writer to be a bit of an outsider. And the way in which I grew up, living on a boat. So even though I was part of a different set of communities in the islands than I am here in the States, even then I wasn't really a part of those communities, because, again, I lived on a boat off of them. And I think that has given me a fair amount of sort of ability to sort of look at things and sort of step outside and explore them a little bit easier. And that, of course, is a useful skill to have as a writer. And secondly, yeah, I think that one of the interesting things to me was I was looking at my bookshelf not too long ago, and I realized that all the science fiction that I was enjoying the most came from writers from outside the U.S., Commonwealth writers, science fiction writers. So we had Australians, Canadians, Brits, Scottish, and Irish writers were all on my shelf, and I realized that it's been a really interesting period for those writers, and the Commonwealth writers are really producing some fascinating science fiction. And that I found that really interesting. That I kind of, I'm not really outside of the U.S. anymore. I'm sort of living here in Ohio and in the Midwest, but I definitely have that background. My biological father is Caribbean. I'm related to the whole island of pretty much Carriacou or Petit Martinique, and I still have a lot of relatives in Grenada. And growing up for the first 9 years of my life around that environment is just very useful to come from a different place like that. And I certainly think it is good for science fiction that we're starting to get people who are sort of more diverse from a more diverse populace. We still have a long way to go.
Sure, sure. And I wonder if you've ever thought about that. Again, not to kind of pull you into some type of controversy, but it's always been interesting to me.
That's what the internet is for, man.
Yeah, exactly. It's always been interesting to me that ostensibly science fiction is a literature about embracing new ideas, new cultures, new experiences, and yet there's a huge part of the genre that well, I don't have numbers, but
right.
There's definitely a presence within the genre of, for the lack of a better word, a very conservative mindset, and it's just interesting to me that I guess it's the big tent theory that there's something within the genre for everyone, but to me it's always been kind of an odd experience to look at various blogs or even before blogs, discussions and various letter columns that there's definitely a audience of science fiction readers that would identify themselves as being very conservative politically and socially, and it's always been a head scratcher to me.
Yeah, it's a pretty big tent. I mean, there's a little bit of science fiction for everyone, so that's not surprising. It does surprise me that a group of people who are interested in the future or want to think about the future a lot are sort of somewhat resistant to change. But that's because I think in some parts of science fiction it's people are not seeing all the readers. I did an experiment once where I sat at a books. I've done this quite a few times. I like to do it because I sat at a bookstore in a science fiction section and interviewed everyone who came through and kept some rough statistics. And all kinds of people read science fiction. People show up in business suits. People show up, looking scruffy. You get people who look like people imagine a fan to be, and people who don't, just as you do when you go to a science fiction convention. It's not just the people who are dressing up as their favorite character. You get a full range of people. And it's something I think a lot of people forget. And I think that there are a lot more diverse people reading science fiction than anyone realizes. And that the fandom, which is people going to science fiction conventions, that started out as a particular subculture, and as a result, it was very It started as a particular subculture grounded in a literature that's very interested in modernization, modernistic thought impulse, and was written mainly by engineers who tended to be usually in the 1950s and 40s. Engineers tended to be in the U.S. white. So what you get a lot of is that continuation of the engineers and scientists' background being, influencing fandom, and for a lot of it being mainly of that background. And it's never really stopped and thought about trying to recruit out. But I think the actual readers of science fiction, the people who buy the books, are not represented by fandom, even though fandom is a tremendous special interest group and has a lot of voice, and it's wonderful because it has sustained short stories and sustained a lot of the vitality of the genre, and certainly sustains authors' careers and gets word of mouth out and jumpstarts careers. I think a lot of people also then tend to forget that science fiction readers are a slice of whatever country they're being sold in. And if you look at America, that means it's a very diverse readership.
Sure.
And so I think we do ourselves a disservice when we I think the field has done itself a disservice by not having more writers, not welcoming more writers of diversity, and by not having more characters, not making it feel like it's more welcoming to diversity. But I think a lot of that's changing. I'm very optimistic about it. People always get upset with me when I just point out the simple math of, how few writers of diverse backgrounds there are, just by saying, look at the U.S. Census and then match it up to the number of writers out there. And you can quite plainly see that we're not a very diverse subculture here of writers, but population of writers is also, a skewed sample because we're small. So,
Sure.
statistics skew.
But still,
and it's not
awfully small.
It is an awfully small group, that there are only a handful of, African American writers.
Yeah.
The fact that I know pretty much all the African American writers and can count them off on two hands is a problem. We should, out of 1,000 writers, have closer to 100.
Sure.
If you look at societal statistics. So I'd love to see some of that change, and I see that as being somewhere where we can improve. But it's not. People always get really upset when I point it out, and it's not I'm not agitating for any particular thing. People are like, "Oh, do you want to put quotas?" Or I'm like, "No, I'm just saying that it's something to think about and figure out how you personally want to address it and make it better, or how or just at least recognize that there is this 800-pound gorilla in the room."
Yeah, definitely. I agree, and I agree with you. I tend to be optimistic about the future, and the growth of diversity and both the writing and the authors. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit and quickly talk about. Do you remember the first book that you read and fell in love with?
I remember the first book I read was a Clive Cussler book. I don't remember which one. And I remember the first science fiction book I read was Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke.
Great. And I'm wondering, along those lines, do you remember the first story that you wrote or tried to write in terms of fiction? Your early fictional efforts.
Well, my mom had this interesting thing where, to keep me busy, she'd made taken a big box of matches and written out words on little pieces of paper and put them in there. And I would shake it up and pull out the words and make sentences. So from a very young age, I remember playing with words once I started to learn to read, and just doing that for, writing out sentences and having fun with that. Later on, I think the first short story I ever attempted was in first or second grade, maybe third grade, somewhere in that area. I was at Westmoreland School in Grenada. And I remember that it was a story about a kid who gets lost in a forest and figures out that he needs to figure out where the sun is in order to identify which direction he needs to go to get out of the forest and find a road.
And aren't you supposed to feel the moss and which side of the tree it's growing on?
Well, I mean, I didn't know that one. I don't think there's moss in Grenada, or there may be moss, like water moss, but I mean. The more tropical jungle was
true.
What I'd been exposed to, as well as just being at sea. So my whole situation there was just find the sun.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder, along those same lines, do you remember a specific moment when you said to yourself, that you seriously wanted to pursue fiction writing, and I wonder, if you can remember a specific moment and when that was.
Specific moment? I don't know. What happened was I'm ADD, so I don't really. It's tough for me to pay attention for a whole class. So I used to read books in class all the way through around 7th or 8th grade, and it's cute. It's cute up to 7th grade, but somewhere around 8th grade, what the teachers start doing is getting frustrated that you're still just reading books in class, and they start taking them away. And so what I started to do was write short stories and chapters of novels in class, because it looked like I was taking notes. I stayed out of trouble, and it also kind of entertained me. And I started to sort of fall into the idea kind of gradually that I was somewhat passably decent at this, because people would read snippets and kind of be surprised. I remember, people just sort of saying, "Hey, that's pretty good," and somewhere in that area of time in the 7th or 8th grade, along with that slow development, I remember coming across a book, sort of a children's YA adventure book. And I forget who published it, but it had such horrible dialogue and scenes in it, and it was so badly written, and they're just gaping errors of logic that I remember sort of that little kind of, good grief, I could do better than this sort of light bulb going off. And from that moment on, once I had that sort of confidence that, I'd read something that was beneath what I could do, in my opinion,
Right.
I set out to sort of start submitting short stories.
And when did you start submitting short stories?
My first short story I submitted when I was 15 to Writers of the Future, because the anthology came down to the grocery stores down there, and they had little book racks, and I picked up one of the Writers of the Future anthologies, and they had the instructions in the back on how to submit. So when I was 15, I wrote my first complete short story, which I still have. I just donated to the archives at Northern Illinois University, and went ahead and wrote a complete short story and mailed it off.
Great. And what was the process like from there to your first publication?
Well, I mean, I started doing occasional short stories in, all throughout high school. So from 15 to 17-ish, my sophomore, junior, senior year of high school. And when I went to college, my sophomore year, I decided to get really serious. I bought a laptop. I learned how to touch type, and I set out to submit a lot of short stories and write a lot of short stories. So somewhere around the age of like 19 or so, 18 or 19, I started really trying to I had to set this goal of getting 100 rejections a year, because I determined that I couldn't guarantee or make a professional sale. It was out of my ability, but I could definitely get a rejection just by writing a short story, sending it off, and getting it back. So in order to have an observable goal, I set myself the goal of having 100 rejections every year. And in order to do that, I'd have to write, X number of short stories and submit short stories and get the rejections back. So I just started cranking out short fiction and learning and reading books on writing, more seriously. I'd been doing it sort of on, as the fancy struck me ever since I was in high school, but I started really buckling down with this idea that I wanted to be published. And when I was, 20, sold my first short story for cash.
And where did you sell that to?
It was a very small little online zine called Jackhammer. They paid a penny a word. I made $7.50. They rounded it up 50 cents and gave me an $8 check, which I then photocopied and framed because I needed the $8 real badly.
I understand. So did you reach your goal of 100 rejections?
Yeah, my sophomore, junior, and senior year of college, I got 100 rejections a year. I racked them in. I think the most I had in one year was 130-something. And I wrote well upwards of 100 and some short stories during that period. So I was trying to, write them as, write a short story at least every 2 weeks. And, it definitely was my an extreme studying phase. I learned a lot. And I also, during the middle part of that, went to the Clarion Science Fiction and Writers Workshop in Michigan, which is now moved out to the West Coast. But that was a really big thing for me to do, too. So in the middle of writing all these short stories, I went to Clarion for 6 weeks and studied with other writers, with the same goal as me, and with instructors who were working writers who talked to me about, the craft and everything. I just soaked it all up and then went back and continued trying to get my 100 rejections a year.
I'm curious, how much of a chance do you have to read for pleasure, and what are some of the books or authors that you've read recently and enjoyed that you would want to talk about?
Sure. I love reading still. It's still what gets me excited about what I do and what my job is. I I'm a fast reader. No one ever taught me that I had to read at a certain speed. And since I am easily distracted, I tend to, as a kid, start reading faster and faster in order to keep myself from getting distracted. So as a result, I've kind of developed a weird way of reading, which is I read a line to a paragraph at a time. And it really works for me. If I really like a book, I'll just keep rereading it. Some of the stuff I've read recently that I really liked, well, Patrick Rothfuss' Name of the Wind was really good. I read that a while back, not too long ago. That was a lot of fun. Really good fantasy book. Been reading a lot of fantasy of late, oddly enough. But I mean, I've been reading a lot of Alistair Reynolds, Ian Banks' latest. You know, I like Ken MacLeod. Just went through some. Just read Prater Moon, which was really good. And let's see, what else? Matter by Ian Banks was a pretty good read.
Great. You mentioned you've been reading a lot of fantasy. I know that primarily your novels have been science fiction. Do you have any thoughts or ideas in terms of writing a big fat fantasy novel?
I don't want to write a big fat fantasy. I actually want to write a very lean, small, tight fantasy. I'm kind of the more I'm reading, the more I'm finding I don't necessarily enjoy the big fat fantasy. I understand why they're big fat fantasy, and I dig the appeal. I flipped through and read George R. R. Martin's recent books because he's always been a favorite author of mine, and whipped through a bunch of other books. And of course, Pat Rothfuss, The Name of the Wind is sort of a big fat fantasy that starts with everyone having a hearty stew at an inn. Which even though it sounds kind of stereotypical, still ends up being just a bloody fantastic book. Just because something's been, sounds used before stereotypical, like a hearty stew at an inn doesn't necessarily mean the story's not going to absolutely rock, and Name of the Wind really does. But I really wanted to do something tight and lean because I'm fascinated by audiobooks right now. And everyone keeps talking about the ebook revolution, but I really think we're going through a tremendous audiobook revolution right now because everyone has an iPod, everyone has an iPhone, millions of people. And what we're seeing is that although ebooks are still going okay, audiobooks are going gangbusters, man, and podcast books are going gangbusters. And I'm really intrigued by this. So what I'm writing right now in my spare time, it's my fun project. I don't have any expectations about it because it's way out of my usual comfort level, but I'm writing a short story, or it's a novella. It's probably going to be about 20 to 30,000 words, no more than 40,000 words, called The Executionist. And it is sort of a high fantasy sword and sorcery type vehicle with maybe a little bit of steampunk thrown in. We'll see as I go along. And it's a lot of fun. I'm having a lot of fun, and it's purposefully written to be tight and purposefully written eventually to be put on audio is what I'm hoping. Because I think that 20,000 words to 30,000 words is a really ideal length for an audiobook. And the really longer stuff, I just downloaded my own novel, Sly Mongoose, which is, for a science fiction novel, pretty short. It's about 80,000 words. 320 pages, and it takes 8 to 10 hours unabridged to read. Now that's pretty cool, but I'm thinking if I'm driving in traffic, even if I have a 1-hour commute each way, it's going to take me a minimum of 6 days. And did I do that right? I think I may have messed up the math on that. It's going to take me a minimum of 5 days,
right,
to get through it. And so that's a whole week to listen to the book. I mean, I guess that's okay, but I'm thinking about myself as a distracted modern man, and I'm just thinking, if I start the book on Wednesday, what happens when I come back to it on Monday?
Sure.
And I'm just listening to books right now on tape as I do these daily walks with my dogs, as I'm trying to get back my health back. And sometimes, I'll skip 2 days or even 3 days before I get back to a book and plug it in and be like, I have no idea, So I'm really wanting to play with this. Elmer Leonard has a really interesting book called Kill Shot, and it's quote unquote called a book, but Kill Shot is actually technically more of what we in science fiction circles would call a novella. Mm-hmm. It's a very, very, very short novel, very lean, and I was able to listen to it. I think the audio was about 3 hours, mm-hmm. So I was able to listen to the whole thing in about a day and a half. And it made a huge difference on how I ingested the whole audiobook experience, because I was able to actually listen to an entire audiobook in a much more discrete time span. And I really am wanting to play with that a lot more.
That sounds very interesting. I'm curious. Going back for a minute to talking about some of the books that you've read recently. I'm just curious if there are any specific authors or specific books over over your career thus far that have had a particular impact on you or made a lasting impression.
Well, of course, Childhood's End had a really big impression because it's the one that sort of was the first hit that got me hooked on science fiction. Arthur C. Clarke has a very fond place in my heart as a result, because he's the person who really did convert me to being a science fiction reader. And I love his sort of global outlook, how global his writing is. He has this interesting perspective that's not as limited as sometimes I feel like I find in some writing. His characters seem to come from all over the world. And I really respect that. But the writers who really got me fired up in high school were I had a really great week once where I read Neuromancer, A Fire Upon the Deep, and Islands in the Net all in the same week. Those are all some pretty darn good books. Neuromancer, of course, started the whole cyberpunk novel series with William Gibson. That kind of got me hooked on cyberpunk because I have this real fondness for noir. Even as a kid, I used to read hard-boiled detective mysteries. Just love the tone, the atmosphere of a good noir, hard-boiled mystery. And so coming across this in science fiction just scratched a lot of my buttons just perfectly. So Neuromancer definitely plugged in and lit me up. Islands in the Net by Bruce Sterling got me hooked on Bruce Sterling. I love most of Bruce Sterling's novels. And Islands in the Net is a big book for me because it was written, the first third of it is set in Grenada, which is, of course, where I grew up the first nine or so years of my life. And so to see the Caribbean featured in a science fiction novel as a entity with its own, with the ability to play in a larger global world, just really struck me as being something that I wanted to do. And that book really inspired me to go ahead and think about and just want to become a Caribbean science fiction writer, and take some of the stuff that I was thinking about wanting to bring to science fiction, and kind of gave me permission to go ahead and bring it. And as a result, Crystal Rain and Ragamuffin and Sly Mongoose are all books that are inspired by that kind of fusion. The other book that really had a huge impact on me was Vernor Vinge's A Fire Upon the Deep. It's a book I really loved, and I just kept reading and rereading that. So 3 books that had a huge impact on my writing and that stuck with me for the rest of my life, and I happened to encounter them all on the same week. So in high school it was horrible because for the next 5 or 6 months I was just a cyberpunk imitator. That's all I would write.
Yep. I'm curious. You mentioned the fantasy novella idea that you're kind of toying with, and I just mentioned that you recently had your Halo media tie-in novel published. I'm curious if you have started working on another full-length science fiction novel. Are you working on something now?
I'm kind of in between. We finished up the Halo thing, and then I had my health kind of fall apart on me. We've been happy with the sales of Crystal Rain, Ragamuffin, Sly Mongoose, but or at least I have been happy with them, but they're not nearly as big as everyone's hoping for. And so, one thing we're discussing is where to go next. And so I've got some ideas of some novels that I would like to write for the next 2 books while we just take a break, and wait for people to find Crystal Rain, Ragamuffin, Sly Mongoose, and see how the sales of that continue on. One of the weird things about writing is that sometimes if it's not an instant hit, it can take a while for you to kind of see how sales, ended up influencing. We're still selling the paperback of Ragamuffin. It's still out there.
Mm-hmm.
We know pretty much how Crystal Rain did, but Ragamuffin and Slime Mongoose results haven't come back. And, I didn't shoot up on the bestseller lists overnight there, so we just got
Sure.
to wait and see how everything trickles down and finishes up. But yeah, there's kind of, we could, with the success of Halo and everything behind us, interested in trying something new for the next 2 books that Tor is into me for. And I'm actually interested in trying something different now. I've, enjoyed playing around with the series that I did, but I've definitely got lots of other novel ideas. So right now it's just kind of, we're in between, and probably it'll all get hammered down in early February is when I'll start doing the next book. So
Sure.
to be honest with you, I have no idea what's coming next. I'm taking the time to do some freelance work and catch up on stuff, and definitely play around with that little novella.
Sure, sure. Well, good luck with all of that entails. I want to wrap up now, but I did want to ask a final question, and that is for someone who's listening to this interview and podcast who may be an aspiring writer. If you have any suggestions, ideas, motivating thoughts for them.
Well, I mean, the stuff I always talk about is the practice of writing. And the most important thing is to get in there and the biggest part of the word writer is the word write. And I think that, whatever your schedule is, whether you spend one night a week writing, for 4 or 5 hours and bursting a whole lot out and spending the rest of the week thinking about it, or whether you write a little bit every night, that no matter what you do, you just have to write a lot, or focus on the act of writing a lot and practice, practice, practice.
Sure. Well, good. Thanks for that advice. And again, we've been speaking with Tobias Buckell. His latest novel is Halo, the Cold Protocol, available at bookstores everywhere. You can check him out online at tobiasbuckell.com, all one word, no spaces. And as he mentioned earlier, he has a upcoming short story collection going to be published later this year by Worm Publishing, and that's WYRM. And I think that's it for now. Thanks, Toby.
Oh, thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it, man.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Reading and Writing Podcast. If you liked what you heard, you can subscribe to our feed in iTunes, leave a review on iTunes, or send us an email at readingandwritingpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks, and we will be back soon with another interview with a writer that you enjoy reading.